Okay, yeah, you can clap. That's a pretty good video. You can clap if your life feels like that sometimes. I can clap for that too. Well, good morning again, everyone. Welcome to the house of the Lord. We've got a new series that we're doing right now called Creating Spaces, Giving Yourself Some Breathing Room. And we're asking the question, how are our lives affected when our schedules are so cram-packed that we just feel like we can't add anything else in? And when someone comes and asks us to do something, we feel like we just have to constantly say no, because if we add one more thing in our schedule, it'll just collapse like a house of cards. We're asking how our lives are affected when our budget is so full and we have so many bills and we live at the limit financially that we're constantly living in fear, because if there were one little financial blip, we're not sure if we'd be able to sustain it. And we're asking how all of this affects our relationships when our relationships are weighed down with so much busyness and we're kind of jumping from one person to the next and living life on the surface, and our schedule is so full that we can't go very deep. What does that do to our relationships? And we're asking not only how does this affect our life, but we're asking what are the root causes of this, and how can we either avoid allowing our schedule to get out of control, which also leads to our life being out of control, and whether or not the Bible has anything to say about this. And so last Sunday we talked a little bit about breathing room, and following some work by Pastor Andy Stanley at North Point Church in Atlanta, Georgia, we got this great definition that breathing room is the space between our current pace, how fast you're going, and our natural limits. And whenever there's no space between our pace and our limits, there's no breathing room. And all kinds of things happen. The first thing that happens is our stress level goes through the roof. And we get irritable, right? And we get snappy with people. Our focus tends to narrow on our problems. When we're stressed out, instead of being grateful for all the good things in our life, we tend to focus on problems. And this robs us of a heart of gratitude and a spirit of thankfulness, which kind of makes life a little miserable. And then our relationships suffer greatly. And we believe that our relationships are the most important things that we have. And so the very most important things get drained off by this busyness. And then we talked about how the Bible has something to say about this. We talked about God liberating the Hebrews from Egyptian slavery, and when He led them to the new land, He gave them a brand new way of life. And in order to communicate that life, He gave them a list of rules that would constitute them as a covenant people. Again, covenant is promises made and promises kept. And so when we look at the top 10 rules for God's new way of life, we see built in this command that you must take a day off. That you have to take a day off of work. It's actually illegal according to God's way of life. It's against the law to work 7 days a week. It's against the law to work 24/7. And so this idea that in the very creation of the world, when God gives us His rules for life, we see breathing room is already built in to that. And today, we're going to turn our attention to our schedules. And the title of this message is How to Regain Sanity in Your Schedule. We're going to talk about breathing room in our schedules. And so I want to begin by saying that our natural inclination is just to cram as much as we possibly can into our schedules. And our culture actually rewards this. Our culture says that your value is based on your productivity. And so the more active you are and the fuller your schedule is, then the more important you are. Right? And so if you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off, it gives you this overinflated sense of importance. Like you must be doing something right because so many people need you and you have so many places to go and so many people to see. And so we enter this phenomenon in which we do so much that we don't enjoy what we're doing. Have you experienced that? We do so much that we don't enjoy what we're doing. And so think about the pace of your life, right? I mean, we're constantly again, running around like a chicken with our head cut off. We get in the car, we're always running about 15 minutes late, and we speed from one place to the other place. And as we interact with people, they have just a little bit of our time. They feel anxiety just being in the same space as us because we're so hurried, right? We're eating in the car. And of course, the fast food industry has capitalized on this. They know that we don't have any time. They know that we're busy. And so they actually package their food in a way to make it easier to eat in the car, so you don't spill stuff on your seats. And so we're speeding around. We're eating in our cars. If you've got children, you don't want to feel like a jerk. And so you feel like, they're involved in sports and dance and gymnastics and, they're playing instruments, advances, music. And we feel like, like we got to jump in somewhere and we got to at least show up so our kids don't think that we don't care about them. And so how do we do that, right? If it's a music recital, we think, we ask our wife or our husband, so honey, when does our child play? Okay, it's about 2/3 into the program, and then we can show up late right before they go on, and we can sit down, and as our kid comes out, we can put on a smile and go, Daddy's here or Mommy's here, and then as soon as they walk off the stage, I got to go, I got another appointment, soon. Or if they're in sports, we show up at the very beginning of the game, right? So that we can see little Johnny hit the ball off the tee for the very first time, and then we can say, hey, I was here, great job, Johnny, now I got to go. Or we come at the end of the game so that we can go off and have ice cream or hamburgers and act as if we were there the whole time. And so we're doing so much. Our schedule is so full, it's so hectic. And if you have kids, not only are you soliciting innocent bystanders into your own dysfunction, but oftentimes you're forcing them to keep schedules like you. And so I hear parents all the time saying, I got to sign them up for soccer and t-ball and football, and we want them to be real balanced and need to play an instrument, so we'll get them involved in piano too, and maybe gymnastics or the swim team. And we start signing our kids up for everything that we possibly can, because God forbid they miss their calling. God forbid they don't discover some latent skill to become the next Michael Jordan, right? So we got to get them involved in everything so that they're well-rounded. And before we know it, we have forced our busy schedule onto them, and instead of being their parents, we're their chauffeur, getting them from one place to the other, right? And so we're not only modeling this hectic, insane life to our kids, we're forcing them into it. And let me tell you, parents, if you're Christians and you're professing to be a Christian, then you have to ask, what do your actions say about God's way of living? What are you teaching kids, not only with your words, but with your actions about God's way of life? Because we're telling them not only this is normal, all families do this, but we're also saying, if we're Christians, this is God's approved way of life. And we might say something different with our mouths, but that's what we're saying with our actions. And if you're single, you're not off the hook. Actually, if you're single, things might be worse for you, because there's no one at home to hold you accountable for your time. And so you might find it incredibly difficult to say no to anything. And I've already talked about how if you're single, sometimes you're looking, or at least you're open to meeting, God's match for you. That's not a plug for Christian Mingle, but you're looking for God's match for you. No judgment, right? So you don't want to stay home all the time, and so people ask you to do things, and you sign up for everything you possibly can out of fear that you might miss an opportunity to meet the love of your life. And since there's no one at home saying, hey, where are you? We might find it difficult to say no to anything. And if you're a student, your teachers want you to study all the time, right? And so that further complicates your life. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want to share one main idea from the Bible, and with it, one simple application that will change your life. Okay, so if you have your Bibles here this morning, or you have your tablets or your phones, I want you to go to Psalm 90. Okay? Now, as you're finding the scripture verse, I want to say we're only going to look at verses 1 to 6 and verse 12. And personally, I didn't want to do this. I don't like to take bits and pieces of the Bible and leave important things out. And I'll tell you that when I was reading Psalm 90, there's this really interesting chunk in the middle that starts with verse 7 that talks all about God's anger and wrath. And it made me really uncomfortable when I read it. And I wanted to understand what this was all about. And so I did a lot of research and looked at a lot of commentaries. And I actually, in the first draft of the sermon, wrote a whole section on understanding the wrath and anger of God in Psalm 90. But in the interest of time, I know that my sermon length has been creeping through the weeks, and I'm trying to rein that in and get that under control. And so I actually omitted that part. But for those of you that are interested, I will post that commentary on Facebook this afternoon. So if you want to read all of Psalm 90 and you want to try to figure out that stuff about God's anger and wrath, it'll be very clear in that commentary. You can check that out. Okay? So, but what I want to do is I want to focus on Psalm 90, verses 1 to 6. So I'm going to ask Emma if she'll throw up verses 1 to 2. And let's just start looking at this. Let's go through it, because there's some great stuff in here, right? So the author says this: Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Now note there are multiple generations, which signals the passing of time. We'll come back to that. Before the mountains were brought forth, and actually the better Hebrew word that interprets that is born. This idea that God is giving birth to the mountains. Before the mountains were brought forth, or you ever formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you were God. And what we see here from the very beginning is a statement of faith, hope, and love. It is a claim that God is faithful through all the ups and all the downs of life. God has been the dwelling place of these people. And so whether they had a temple or whether their temple had been torn down, whether they were ruling themselves and had their own government, or whether they were in exile and somebody else was ruling them, whether they had a place of worship or whether their place of worship had been torn down and desecrated, whether they were free or whether they were slaves, throughout the history of all generations, the claim is that God has been faithful, and no matter what they went through, they could rest and find a resting place in God. And that's important for us to claim this morning, because I know that in our crazy, hectic lives, sometimes we feel like we have no rest. And I want to say right now, you do have a resting place. You just have to set time aside to enter into that resting place with the Lord. But that's not the most important point here. Because what I really want to draw out of these first two verses is this introduction of the theme of time. Okay? And what we see here is a comparison. We see that human generations come and go. But God is from everlasting to everlasting. Human beings are finite. Our existence is temporal and transient. We are here today and gone tomorrow. But God is eternal. God is always God. Okay? And so the first thing that we see is that human time, and if you're a note taker, this is something to write down. Human time finds its source and its destiny in God's time. Did you hear that? In other words, all human time, or God's time, is all-encompassing of human time and space. Okay? And what that means is that human time, my time and your time, will have no lasting meaning or significance unless it finds its source, unless it is grounded in, unless it is seen as a precious gift of God that comes out of His infinite time. Does that make sense? So if you're thinking of concentric circles, it's not like God's time is over here and your time is over here. It's that God's time is the big circle, and your time only finds its purpose, its meaning, and its value as a small circle in God's big circle of time. Okay? And this is really, really important. As we turn to the next verses that make it crystal clear, the next slide, that make it crystal clear that our life is very short-lived. Okay, so there's this initial comparison between God's time and our time, and there's this message that if our time is going to have any lasting meaning and value, it has to be grounded and rooted in God's time, in God's eternity. And then things get even more interesting when we start comparing God's forever and ever, from everlasting to everlasting, with our life. And so it says here of God, you turn us back to dust. You say, turn back, you mortals, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it's past, or like a watch in the night. I just hold it right there. Just hold it right there. Okay? And I want to say this makes very clear that we are here today and gone tomorrow. Now, I just did a graveside service yesterday for a young man named Patrick Dean. We actually did his funeral here at the church earlier this year. and then they had him cremated, and we did the committal service at graveside yesterday. And every time there is a committal service, there is a point in time in which I, as the pastor, when I'm committing that body to the ground, when I say earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The idea that we came from the dust and we will eventually return to the dust. And the same thing on Ash Wednesday. And for those of you who are part of the Christian tradition, we gather on Ash Wednesday, which is the day that begins the season of Lent, leading up to Easter, right? Leading up to Holy Week and Easter. And during that time, we take ashes that come from burned palm branches, right? We take the church is supposed to take the palm branches from the previous year. You burn them, you take those ashes, you mix them with oil, and then at the end of the service, people come forward and they kneel down humbly before God, and I dip my finger in the ashes and I make the sign of the cross on your forehead, and do you remember what I say? From the dust you came, and to the dust you will return. And so, we see that we are here today and we are gone tomorrow. And if we are going to genuinely be able to appreciate our time as a rare, precious gift with limits, then it's important for us to contemplate, at least occasionally, our mortality. And so the next part of it says, back again, sorry, Emma, that to God 1,000 years is like a watch night. Now, this is really cool to me. I did some math, right? And I thought, okay, what's a watch night? A watch night's like 3 hours. So if 1,000 years to God is like 3 hours, then if we do the math and start with someone who lives to be 75 years old, then the span of your life is like 11 minutes to God. Okay? Now let me just put that into context. That means that if God were watching your favorite sitcom in heaven, you would be dead before the first commercial break. Right? Let me say, your life would be like a short YouTube video. Okay? And this is my favorite, right? Before God finished listening to Pink Floyd, Shine On You Crazy Diamond Part 1, you'd be dead. Right? That's how short your life is. Right? Here today, and gone tomorrow. Now go to the next slide. And then it says, and this is the way, instead of talking about Pink Floyd and YouTube and your favorite sitcom, this is the way the psalmist explains it, which is equally as interesting to me. It says, you sweep them away. They are like a dream. Now think about that, a dream. You close your eyes and think about how quick and episodic your dreams are, how it goes from one to the other. Not just going to bed and having one dream, the short episodic dreams. It's like a dream, like grass that springs up in the morning, right, and flourishes and is renewed, and by the evening, because of the scorching sun, it withers and dies. That is equivalent to the time span of our life. And so, it is important for us to understand that we're not going to live forever. That there are limits. And when we understand that we're not going to live forever, when we understand that our life is a precious gift from God, it helps us to be a little more careful about how we schedule our time. Because folks, whether you like it or not, as your schedule is, so will your life be. Your life is how you spend your time. It's what you do with your time. So the main point here is that we need to understand that we only have a little tiny slice of life. Our life is like a blip, like a blink of an eye in the grander scheme of things. And we need to understand that every single breathing moment that we have is a precious gift of God that once it's gone, we can't ever get back. Which means we have to be really careful how we schedule our time. And if we understand that life is a precious gift, then we will rethink a life or a schedule that looks like this. Right? Remember, in the first message I said, it's okay for your closet to look like this. It's okay for the backseat of your car to look like this, your basement or your attic, but it's not okay for your schedule to look like this. Now I know that it's difficult to think from this perspective. Until we get a scare from a doctor or lose a loved one, we tend to think that we have all the time in the world, right? And if you've got all the time in the world, I mean, think about if you had an unlimited supply of money, would you be very careful with the way that you spend it? No, we'd squander it, right? And oftentimes we live and we schedule our lives based on the idea that we have all the time in the world. And so it doesn't really matter if we miscalculate and overschedule and even waste some of our time. And the psalmist says this is a big mistake. And so what's the application here? So the big idea is life is not forever. It's short. You're here today and gone tomorrow. So let's think carefully about how we spend our time. What's the application? This gets us to verse 12, which is pretty awesome, I think. Right? There are people who look at the Bible and they don't read it because they think it's antiquated. Right? But I'm going to tell you, if you actually read the Bible, not only will you understand Western society better because the Judeo-Christian tradition has informed the development of Western culture. Even if you're an atheist, you benefit from reading the Bible to understand the context in which you live. But if you just go to the Word and say, Lord, speak to me, what you'll find is that the Bible says all kind of really, really interesting, relevant things, if you'll just give it a chance. And this is one of those things. It says, if we can have this perspective, if we can understand our time as finding its source, its value, its meaning, and its destiny in God's time, if we understand the limited time we have in comparison with God's eternity, then God can help us to count our days. Count your days. You know, again, sometimes we act like we're going to live forever. We act like our kids are going to be little and live in the house forever. And I know there are people here, I know Marty, and there are others here today whose kids have grown up and gone to college. And sometimes we take it for granted. I'm not saying you did, Marty, or anybody else, but sometimes we take it for granted and we think that our kids are going to be at home forever, and then all of a sudden they drive off in the car and we're like, oh man. Right? They're not going to be here forever. Sometimes we feel like our spouse is going to be here forever. That relationship is going to be there forever. And so we neglect it. We don't spend time with our spouse. We don't do the things that we know we need to do to build that relationship. And then one day you get the divorce papers and you realize that relationship's not going to be there forever. Or your spouse has a heart attack or a stroke and loses all their mobility and has to go live in a nursing home, and all of a sudden they're not at home anymore. Or worst case scenario, they die. Right? We think that we're going to have our job forever. And we'll talk about this next week. So we plan our finances accordingly. We keep adding more and more and more bills, thinking that we're just going to keep that money and we're going to keep getting raises and we're going to follow that trend all the way up. We think that we're going to have our health forever and our mobility. I was just talking, I don't know if Miss Ruth is here this morning, but I saw Miss Ruth yesterday at the graveside service, and her sister was visiting from out of state, and she said to me, you know, Mark, the doctors say I can't drive anymore. Right? So we think that we're going to be able to pick up and go and do what we want to do when we want to do it, and that there'll never come a time when we'll have limits on our mobility. And so when we live this way, we actually mismanage our time with the assumption that it doesn't matter because we have unlimited time. And again, the psalmist says, this is a really bad idea. Rather than doing that, we have to learn how to number our days. And you know, when we think about it, the psalmist gets it right if we think about the way that we already number our days in other aspects of our life. I mean, think about this. Did anybody come to Kathy and Al's wedding last Saturday? A few people here, right? Now, when Al, and if you haven't heard the story of how Kathy and Al met, it's really, really cool. Al's actually a really creative, romantic guy, despite the fact that he's a biker, right? So go and ask him how did he meet Kathy. It's really cool. Or how he asked her to marry him. So the minute that Kathy said yes to Al, you can bet your bottom dollar that both of them started numbering their days until the wedding date, especially Kathy, right? And so they set a date, and all of a sudden they become aware there is a limit on the time that we have to plan. And I see Kim here too, and Kim and Mike got married on Saturday. This was the second wedding. It's back here in the back, right, on Saturday. So the minute that you set a date, you become aware there is a limit on the amount of time that I have to plan this thing, and there's a lot of things to do, and so as we number the days, knowing that there's an end point, we start organizing our time and creating a plan. And the way that we spend our time in the interim becomes very important. Right? And the same thing happens with my students. You know, I teach ethics at Florida Southern College, and when it comes about mid-semester, I do a writing workshop, and I remind them when their term paper is due. And let me tell you, they start numbering their days. Right? Some of them start numbering their days very quick, and they create a writing plan so that they can turn in a high-quality product on time. I wish I could say that most do. They don't. Most start numbering their days, or actually most start numbering their hours the day before. But nevertheless, there's a deadline there, right? And the students know, I don't have forever to write this paper. And when we know that we don't have forever to write the paper, then we start making more careful choices of how we spend our time leading up to it. And those of you that are just kind of going to work every week, you know this too. You know, if you own a business and you get a job, you know, you tell people, I'm going to be done by this time. Or if you manage projects at work as a project manager, you know that you've got deadlines. And these deadlines make it very clear that you don't have forever to get the job done. And if you act like you do, you'll lose business. Unless you're really good. The guy that ships my surfboards, he lives on Bahama time. And so he just says, yeah, I'll get it to you when I get it to you. And like a month later, I'm calling him saying, babe, when's my board going to be done? But the only reason I keep going back to him is he's really good and he's very affordable. But most people that act like they have unlimited time and don't meet their deadlines end up getting in a lot of trouble. Right? And so what does it mean to number your days in the context of your schedule and your whole life? What it means is realizing that you don't have forever. If you are 16, you'll never be 16 again. You'll never experience what it's like to get in the car and drive for the very first time. That's gone. If you're 18, you'll never remember the glory that you felt when you voted for the first time. That was a joke. You can laugh. And so it goes. You can't get your 20s back. You can't get your 30s back. Time is precious. And if we will number our days, here's the promise. Then God says, I will give you a heart of wisdom. Give you a heart of wisdom. Now, when we think about what it means to have a heart of wisdom in our schedule, what this means is being able to have the wisdom to prayerfully discern what gets left in and what gets taken out. What you do more of and what you do less of. It means getting our priorities straight. And there's a great quote that I came across by Andy Stanley that I want to share with you this morning that really, actually there are two quotes and they capture it perfectly. This is what he says. Remembering that our time is limited provides us with wisdom to know how to spend our time. Let's say that once more. Remembering that our time is limited provides us with wisdom to how to spend our limited time. And then here's one more quote that I love, and he says this over and over again in his message on busyness. He says, my time is limited, so I have to limit how I spend my time. My time is limited, so I have to limit how I spend my time. I want to close this morning by asking, what would happen if we could fast forward our life to the very end? And we could have a conversation with ourselves in our final days. Now, I know this isn't literally possible, but it is possible imaginatively because of the work of an Australian author and songwriter, and her name is Bonnie Ware. Bonnie wrote a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. And it's a memoir of how her life was transformed by wrestling with the regrets that people had that she was caring for who were in their final days. And I'm not going to list all 5. I'm just going to share 2 with you this morning. But what's very interesting, you can go to do a Google search on Bonnie Ware. She has a website, and you can see the other 3, or you can just buy her book and read it. Right? And she says that once we spend some time with the dying, and we listen to their top regrets, it helps us to imaginatively fast forward our own life and imagine, what is it going to be like when I'm lying there? What am I going to be saying? Am I going to be full of regret, or am I going to be very happy with the life that I live? And one of the things that all the men said was, I wish I had not worked so much. Every single man that was on their deathbed that Bronnie worked with said this. And many, if not most of the women, did as well. And what this means is that if we do not number our days and gain a heart of wisdom in our schedule, then we will not prioritize our most important relationships. We will work ourselves to death out of fear of falling behind or being poor, or whatever the case might be. And as we look back, we will have regrets that we spent our time on the wrong thing. Again, when you think that you have all the time in the world, when you think that your spouse and your kids, and check this out, when you think that your elderly parents are going to be around forever. Right? I have a friend who is older, and he can't get his son to spend any time with him. Right? And he knows he didn't spend enough time with his son when he was young. And it's, again, like last week, it's all cats in the cradle, but it does come full circle, right? And sometimes you think our parents are going to be around forever. They retire, and they want to spend time with us, and we're too busy for them, and then you get the phone call that Dad's had a heart attack, and there's no more time with Dad anymore. So when we live our life this way, when we live like we don't have any limits and that these people are going to be around forever, and then something happens and they're not, the reality that we don't have all the time in the world smacks us in the face. And then we have regret. The good news is, you have a choice in all of this. You don't have to wait until you're dying to get your priorities right. You can learn from these people who had no choice to number their days because they were terminally ill. And then here's the next one. The number one regret in youth, the youth in the room, I want you to particularly pay attention to this. The number one regret of everybody that Bronnie worked with was that I wish I had had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. Did you hear that, youth? It's not about your parents' dream. It's not about your grandparents' dream. It's not about societal expectations. It's about you finding your God-given passion and finding a way to do that. And there are so many unfulfilled dreams, so many lives lived with regret when people realize that instead of doing what they love, doing what they were passionate about, they let other people determine the course of their life. They let other people determine their value and their purpose. They let other people determine how they were going to make their choices and spend their time. And remember, if you're not intentional about your time, you will not be in control, but other people will tell you what to do. And your life will then become out of control. And so, what would happen if we fast forwarded our life and began to think through these common human regrets? How would it change the way that we understand the gift of time and how we spend our time? And listen, I know the fears that keep us from doing this. I know that you're saying, well, what if I never make it? Well, I would ask you to answer the question, what is it? What are you trying to make? I'm scared I'll never make it. Or I'm scared I'm going to fall behind. Fall behind who? Or I'm scared I'm going to be poor. Some of you are because of your upbringing, especially if you grew up poor, you carry this fear in your heart all the time. And it is eating you up inside because you're scared to death you're going to be poor. We have to define what poor is, first of all. But second of all, do you really want the fear of not surviving, of being poor, to control your life and make you work and work to the point where you are actually a workaholic? Or I won't be accepted, right? If I tell people no, then they'll reject me, and so I want to be accepted, and so I have to keep this pace where I'm redlining it all the time. Or I won't measure up. Who are you trying to measure up to? And so here's my challenge this morning. Are you proud of me? Less than 40 minutes. here's my challenge. I'm going to ask the praise band to come forward as I issue this challenge. The first challenge is, I want to ask you, who's in control of your life right now? And I got to tell you, whether you're a Christian or not, as a pastor, I have to tell you, God has a plan for your life. God cares about you. And the way that you spend your time is not just a personal choice, right? It's not, you weren't created to live in complete autonomy and to do what you want to do when you want to do it. And the reality is, if you talk to everybody who tried to do that, at some point what they tell you is that when I was running my life, I eventually ran it into a ditch. And I can attest to that in my own personal life. God has a plan for you. Right? God cares how you spend your time. And the first thing that we have to do in order to gain sanity in our schedule is really, truly surrender our life to Christ. Not only as Savior, which is the part where God forgives us, but also as Lord, where we let Jesus have control of our schedule. And if you haven't done that this morning, I would encourage you to take that first step and just say, Lord, I'm sorry for redlining my life. I'm sorry for going and doing it my way all the time and not consulting you and turning away from you. Please forgive me, Lord. And then say, God, I want to say yes to Jesus and I want to give Him control of my life, because guess what? When Jesus is the Lord of your life, you get the honor and the privilege of waking up every morning and saying, Lord, what do I do next? And I can tell you, when I answer that question for myself, I usually misstep or fall in a ditch, or in some way mess it up. But as a Christian, we have the ability to take some time every morning. And if you're Christians and you're not doing this, I would encourage you to do this, to just quiet your heart and say, Lord, I know that as soon as I walk out of this bedroom, my kids are going to be pulling at me from every direction, and I'm going to be so busy, I'm going to hardly know what to do. And so before I hit that hectic, crazy, insane pace, I need you to tell me, Lord, what you want of me today. And I want you to give me the power and the strength of your Holy Spirit to not run myself to death, to help me find my limit. And if you're not letting Jesus be the Lord of your life, in just a minute I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that. If you are a Christian, I want you to look at the piece of paper that you were given when you came in. Just take that out right now. Because once you surrendered your life to Christ, then there's some work to do, right? It's not a magic trick. And if we're going to gain sanity in our schedule, if we're going to learn to number our days and have a heart of wisdom, we're going to have to do some prayerful reflecting on the following questions. And I've provided you with this little piece of paper that I want you to do this week. I really want you to do it and take it seriously. If you do, it'll change your life, even if just a little bit. And I want you to put it on the refrigerator. I want you to, if you're married, I want you to talk to your spouse about this. If you have kids, I want you to talk to your kids about this. I want you to go through this exercise with your children and your youth and your college-age children, young adults. Okay? If you're single and you're dating, I want you to review this with your boyfriend or girlfriend. And if you're in a small group, I would encourage you to bring this to a small group and talk about it. This is important, folks. But I want you to answer the question, number one, what do I need to add to my schedule? You see, if we're so busy that we're redlining it all the time, we can't add even the really important things, like spending time with our kids. What do I need to add to my schedule? The next one is, what do I need to subtract from my schedule? And I want to tell you this morning, for some of you, it's a person. For some of you, there's a person that is burning up all of your time that you need to take a break from. For others, it's activities. What do I need to take out of my schedule, remove to gain some sanity? The next is, what do I need to do more of? Perhaps you are spending time with your wife and kids, but you feel like you need to do more of that, to invest more time with them. And then finally, what do I need to do less of? Right? You might not have to quit going surfing altogether, but maybe just don't go surfing so much. Right? What do I need to do less of? And I'm telling you, folks, this is serious business, because how your schedule is, so goes your life. So this morning, as we invite you to stand and sing our song of response, I want you to be contemplating this. And then after we sing our song of response, we're going to receive Holy Communion. We're going to do the short service. Okay? And when you come forward for Holy Communion, you're going to have a chance to kneel and pray after you receive the elements. But before we do any of this, I want to invite you to stand. And I want everybody to close their eyes in the room. I don't want a single eye peeking or open, right? Please don't, be rebellious and think I'm going to be cool and peek, right? Just everybody close your eyes, okay? You children, everybody too. And if you're here this morning and you have not given your life to Christ, if you're still trying to go it alone, not only in your schedule, but in all aspects of your life, and you need to surrender to Jesus, whether this is the very first time you're doing it, or whether you have wandered off and you seize the reins again, and you need to turn them back over to the Lord, then I just want you, without doing anything else, just to slip up your hand this morning. If you need to surrender your life to Christ, God bless you. God sees you. Here, anyone else? God honors your decision this morning. Another one over here. God honors you. God sees you. Even though nobody else here does, God sees you. Anyone else before we sing our final song? If you're feeling moved this morning, don't let this opportunity go. Anyone else? Glory to God. Can I ask you to now open your eyes and join me as we continue in a spirit of reflection and worship in singing our song of response.